Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and people who are moving through the lunch line, please continue to do so. We're very pleased to have you all here. Sorry it's a little bit crowded. This is obviously a very popular topic. But I'm Suzanne Wands. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. And on behalf of the library, I'd like to thank you all for coming and welcome you to today's book talk. Professor Christine Desan's new book, Making Money, Coin, Currency, and the Coming of Capitalism. We're going to hear from each of the panelists, starting with Professor John Coates, the John E. Cogan Jr. Professor of Law and Economics at HLS, Lauren Coyle, lecturer on law at HLS and also lecturer on social studies at Harvard College, Professor Duncan Kennedy, the Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence here at HLS, and from the Harvard Business School, Professor Sir Paul Tucker. But to get us started, we're going to have our author, Professor Desan, speak. Welcome.
So I want to thank Suzanne and June and Meg, the folks who really put this event together. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the panelists for taking the time to read whatever part of the book they read and think about what to say. And I want to thank you all for coming, including my mother, who's here somewhere. So I have just a few minutes to tell you what the book is about, and given that time, I'm going to plunge right in. The book is about a revolution in money's design. The revolution occurred in early modern England. The revolution changed the way political communities create money. It changed how they, or how we, pay for money, how we think about human agency, how we define the market and its relationship to the public. The revolution in money's design, I argue, inaugurated capitalism. The book is also about how the revolution disappeared, how it vanished as an event that we see and talk about. Rather than talk about money's radical redesign, or even its design at all, we assume that money is a matter made as people exchange. It's a matter made by individuals. It's a convention they adopt, an empty unit of measure. A number, it's a term, the term of price. Money is a matter so empty. If money is a matter so empty and so neutral, then there's nothing to unpack. We don't ask about money's design. That renders the revolution in money's design almost invisible. And given its invisibility, we lose the capacity to think critically about the design decisions made then and the changes they introduced. So I want to say just a word about money's design, then a word about money's radical redesign, and finally a word about how that revolutionary redesign disappeared from view. So first, money's design. In economic terminology, money is a unit of account, a mode of payment, a medium of exchange. It's more interesting for what it does than for what it is. But if we look behind the labels, these dry labels, we find a drama. In order to make a unit of account, a society must create a measure that everyone will understand as a common value and everyone will use when setting a price on objects, labor, even time. The measure must travel from the center of society to its margins. It must deliver value immediately, whether it's paper or metal, plastic or computer code. It must furnish the best mode of payment. It must furnish that mode of payment whether it's traveling between friends, people who know each other and will deal with each other continuously, or whether it's traveling between strangers. Making an entity that can answer demands at once so intimate and so impersonal, so material and so artificial, making money is a governance project, one of the most penetrating governance projects that societies undertake. Money, it turns out, is an institution, an intricately engineered affair. It's made by configuring the way people relate to each other. It's made by imposing relationships, imposing obligations, and then defining ways to satisfy those obligations. So if this sounds familiar, it's law, right? It's made by law. Once we see that, we can get inside money. We can map its design. And that design tells us an enormous amount about the societies that use it. Once we get inside money, we can also see moments of redesign, moments of great change in which societies reshuffle the obligations, authority, and profits that they allocate and the way those matters are conceptualized. So now, on to the monetary revolution. I said it changed the way that political communities create money. Here's the baseline. For centuries, the English government monopolized money creation. There was only one source for coin, that was the royal mint. And coin was the only medium you could use to pay your taxes and pay off private debts. It was the only medium that was freely transferable as a mode of payment, according to the courts. That changed at the beginning of the early modern period. The English government shared its monopoly over money creation with a private group of investors. Here's what happened. The government borrowed £1.5 million from that group, which it ordained the Bank of England. The government took its loan in the form of banknotes. It took notes issued by the bank, promises to pay silver coin. So when the government paid people with banknotes, they held a promise to pay silver coin redeemable at the bank. They also held a note that they could simply return to the government when they paid their taxes. So if you think about this, no one need ever cash the note. The citizen just paid taxes with it, and the government returned the notes to the bank to pay down its debt, that is the debt that the government owed to the bank. And in that moment, we have cash, not credit, not something else, not something conditional. Under those circumstances, anyone would take a Bank of England note because anyone could pass it on. It held value for everyone. So those notes, and only those notes, become cash. The point, money's still a public medium, but the public has licensed a bank to make it, so the public has shared its monopoly. Second change, the revolution in money's design changed the way we pay for money. So for centuries, people paid the government for money. Every time they went to the mint, they paid a fee for coin. So coin by coin, you had to pay for your money by bringing in extra silver for the coin you got back. In the late 17th century, the government began to pay for money. It picked up the cost for coin at the mint, and it paid the Bank of England for producing money. That is, if you think about the borrowing that it's doing, it's paying both for the loan, and it's letting the bank keep the profit that comes from putting new cash into circulation. So the government had borrowed before from the Medicis and all sorts of financiers, but it had never borrowed in the form of notes that would circulate and hold value. It had never borrowed in cash created through the loan, right, for the purpose of the loan. In addition, the government licensed the bank to produce paper money for individuals to buy. That is, it allowed the bank to lend its representations to private borrowers. People now paid the bank, and soon commercial banks, rather than the mint for money. The redesign of money also changed the way we think about human agency. For centuries, people thought that action in one's own self-interest was a vice, not a virtue. It certainly wasn't compatible with the public good. In the late 17th century, the English institutionalized action in one's self-interest as part of the public process. So when the government began to pay the bank for money, it identified investors who were issuing banknotes as doing good by making a profit. Bankers were, after all, making an investment calculation when they issued notes, but the government treated their action as patriotic. So commodity money had long been a scant and difficult medium, and when the bankers became money creators, they benefited the public by producing new liquidity, even as they benefited themselves. So, according to scholars, it's at just this moment that the English upgrade their opinion of self-interest. They begin to identify self-interest as a constructive motivator, one that will move individuals to action that produces good for the whole. We go, as it were, from obvious political construction to the invisible hand, right? Okay, sorry about that. More generally, the redesign of money changed the way we think about the market and its relationship to the public. So for centuries, people thought of the sovereign as the center of the political economy. There's the sovereign in the center. The government was the most important actor. Markets were places ordained by the sovereign where exchange took place, and the sovereign supported that exchange starting with money, right, by creating money, and then following money to define what could be bought or sold. What was a commodity was a function of what could be bought or sold for money. Consider the modern market, right? Money now flows from banks. 95% of the money that we use comes from commercial banks. They appear to be private. Even the high-powered money, or the money we acknowledge as public that comes from the government, comes from a bank, not a mint, not the Treasury. These institutions produce the money supply according to their judgment as experts in investment, and the market they make is huge. So people now hold 65 times as much money. Those are in prices corrected for inflation, so 65 times as much money with purchasing power as they did before the redesign. That is to say, our demand for money is so great that we draw that much from the new institutions, and moneyed exchange now carries us very far. So is it any wonder that money's redesign makes people begin to think of the market as a space produced by entrepreneurs, a space that turns on their judgment, a space with its own autonomy that's separate from the government? In fact, people even begin to think about the public differently, I would say. Perhaps the public is just a big market, a place where people pursue their own interests, and politics perhaps is just an auction over our preferences. If so, the public moves from being the author of the market to being an actor that mimics the market. You could call this constellation of events, and I do, capitalism, a system that combines the government's appointment of banks as agents that produce money, a public subsidy to pay for money's creation, a tendency to identify human agency as the pursuit of private interests, an approach to the market as an autonomous space, and to the public as a market. So capitalism, defined as these components, flowed then to a significant extent from the redesign of money. We debate capitalism constantly, but if capitalism flowed from a redesign of money, then why do we not debate the design of money? There's a short answer and a long answer to the question about money's the disappearance of that debate. The short answer is that once you had that constellation of factors, right? Money is something created by private agents, its production paced by the logic of self-interest, the market as the space made by the exchange that resulted, you really can stop looking for any legal design at all. It isn't necessary to understand money or the market. Money is just an instrument that emerges from exchange, and the market's where the real action is. The longer answer, which I'll just state very briefly given the time, there's a longer answer, I think, although I agree with the shorter answer as well, but the longer answer takes us back to where we started. It takes us back to money's design. I think that the revolution in money's design went underground as part of a constitutional settlement that was crafted by the architects of the modern monetary order, and in some ways continues to be crafted today. They sought to reconcile two opposing forces. On the one hand, they understood, and they still understand, that money is a governance project. It's a mode of mobilizing resources in a material world. It's orchestrated by the public. It takes effect as relationships are reconfigured within a political community. In that sense, money is emphatically public and irreducibly political. On the other hand, the modern method of making money puts private agents in charge. It pledges to protect their incentives as the decision makers who matter, and it expressly adopts their self-interest as the fuel, the expertise that powers the system. The revolution disappeared when the architects of the new system identified money's public purposes with the interests of the private individuals appointed to create it. In the law they shaped, the arguments they made, and the institutions they established, they advertised money's logic as private, even as they relied on legal engineering that was thoroughly public. Thus, they crafted new language about the rights of public creditors, even as they left themselves leeway to swap out the kind of money they'd use to pay the creditors. They identified coin as the paradigmatic money because it was beloved by overseas traders, even as they built exchange around the domestic banknote. They sanctified the discipline that the gold standard imposed, even as they fell back on taxpayers when the system broke. In effect, the architects of the new monetary design reconstructed the way we make money, but denied the very importance of their authority, the way it allocated public authority, the way it distributed profits, and the way it shaped our conceptions of agency and the market. Okay.
So, I'm delighted to read the book. It is also a delight to comment on it. It's intricate, it's compelling. I encourage everyone in the room to get a copy when it's out. It's a huge topic and timely in ways I'll come back to in a minute. Because it's really quality history, it's rich in citations to primary sources, it's got new details that I'm quite sure no one who's written about money before has surfaced. And the bottom line, as Chris just sketched, is that it thoroughly denaturalizes money. It makes it real in the narrative in a way that is generally not done in the history of financial regulation, the history of banks. It destroys the just so stories that are common in not all, but many economics tellings of the role of money in society. And it does so in a way that leaves anybody who thinks about the topic unable to start from that premise easily again. Now, those are all good things. As a commenter, I'm supposed to say some things that are less than thoroughly enthusiastic to get things going in terms of discussion. So let me.
I know about that.
Well, yeah, I need to. I need to. So let me make one observation about it, just from a historical craft perspective. It covers a large swath of time, right? So it starts with Henry II in 1154 and doesn't really end until after the American Revolution, 1797, and it even has some stuff that goes beyond that, but that's the core of many different versions of shifts in the monetary regimes that she's telling the story about. And that means necessarily, despite the detail that it has at different places, it also has to sort of speed by some important elements. And one that I would have highlighted myself, but only maybe because of my own peculiar interests, but I do think it relates to the first theme you set out, which is the coincidence of the creation of this modern monetary regime with the emergence of capitalism. Another coincidence that isn't as highlighted in the book as it could have been if it were a much longer book, was the role of the overseas trading companies. The East India Company is mentioned, South Sea Company is not. There were tremendous, immense personal rivalries represented through those companies with the Bank of England at its inception, and it took 20 years roughly for the bank to win those battles with its corporate rivals. And the East India Company, interestingly, didn't even have one incarnation at the time. It had an old incarnation allied with James and therefore somewhat discredited, but it also had a new incarnation, Whig creation, that was meant to be a new East India Company with different stockholders, which then fought an internecine battle, resulted in a merger, something I teach, so I'm very interested in mergers, and one of the first big corporate mergers between the two incarnations. And then finally, to spell this point out a little bit, why is it that the trading companies, which we wouldn't today think of as a natural place to locate public finance, were the location of public finance? What about the need for the massive capital investment to sustain the quasi-imperialistic, quasi-trading activities of these companies in India and Southeast Asia that interacted with the other political forces that you identify as being a necessary but maybe not sufficient condition for the monetary settlement that you created? So that's just an example of some of the things that are not in here. Now, I'll flip back to positive mode for a second. I think that's okay, right? I mean, Nietzsche identified 3 reasons for doing history. One is monumental, to inspire us to do great things. The second is because we're just into the details. We love the details, the antiquarian desire for truth, and where I'm going there with these details may fall into the antiquarian instinct. And I think the thing that Chris is really after here is the third, which is the critical approach, right? Creating a space for our modern selves to act without being enslaved by ideas of naturalization that some versions of history tend to lead us into, or even worse, ignorance of history. Okay, last point. So I want to, however, now combat the critical part of this book, because while I completely agree that the history of money as told in this book cannot be understood as natural, as the inevitable byproduct of fundamental economic forces that have no choice, political choice or other social choice reflected in them. However, there's another ambition that I think you have, which you say it in the conclusion, but it's a little different, which is to also make the argument that the choices we make are not neutral. And that's partly because they have distributive effects, and it's partly because it has maybe longer-term effects, as you just sketched in the talk, on the way we understand ourselves and understand our society. And I want to try to argue for a slightly different understanding of neutral that maybe is harder to knock down with the story that you tell than the simpler one, which denies any distributive effect. And this story would be really simple on some level. It's just really hard to predict what the long-term consequences or even medium-term consequences of a change or redesign in the monetary system will be. And to make this concrete, let me just put on the table two things that are actually live in public policy debates right now. The Federal Reserve Bank in New York, as many of you may know, is a private entity like the Bank of England. It's charged as the fiscal agent of the United States. It makes a huge profit of something like $48 billion a year handling our money for us. Most of that money comes back to the taxpayer, but they get to keep about $2 billion, and that money then goes out to privately owned banks that are its members. Moreover, its governance is privately dominated. The member banks, the national banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera, have a disproportionate influence in selecting 2/3 of the directors of the Federal Bank of New York, who then select a president. And then importantly, that president sits in the Federal Open Market Committee and has a disproportionate influence on one of the three levers through which the Fed pursues monetary policy. In fact, the most important one today, which is open market operations. Quantitative easing, for those of you who've been reading the papers, that's through this channel, which is then shaped by the politically appointed Board of Governors and through a hybrid negotiation, the privately influenced president of the Federal Reserve Bank. So there have been proposals, Simon Johnson at MIT, for example, to change that, to change the governance of the Federal Reserve Bank. Either he wouldn't abolish it, but he would say, let's make that person a presidential appointee. What would happen if we did that? What would flow from that? Why would we want to do it? Now, there's some just simple accountability and legitimacy things that might flow from that. One quick example, Paul and I heard recently Jeremy Stein, who until recently was on the Board of Governors, give a paper in which he has a proposal for how the Fed ought to be carrying out some of its self-funding that would require more open market operations. And one of the reasons he gave in the discussion as to why he doesn't think it's going to be done, even though he thinks it's a very good idea, I don't have time to go into the details of what he thinks is a good idea, but just assume it's a good idea, is because it would be an open market operation and therefore less legitimate, because it would enhance the profits of private banks. So there's a way in which the governance of the monetary system is defeating arguably a publicly regarded improvement in the way the Fed governs itself. But that's really complicated. It's really hard to figure out what the distributional consequences would be beyond the immediate, which is some greater profit to the banks. And so now just to end, if I'm right in sketching that as a really hard problem to think through beyond immediate short-term political gain, maybe there's something to the economics profession's perspective on money, which is to say it's not actually neutral, it really does have distributional consequences, but since we can't really predict them very well because money affects everything in so many different complex ways, it functions in practice a little bit more neutrally than telling the story in hindsight might suggest, because of course afterwards we can identify the effects. In advance of change, not so clear. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, first, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's a great delight to have the opportunity to speak a bit about this truly incredible, original, and path-breaking book. And I've been very privileged to have been in conversation with Christine Desan for many years. I was her law student, and I can't tell you how exciting and inspiring it is to finally have a read of the final book manuscript. So it's deeply insightful, masterful, and visionary, I would say. And I think it's the type of text that everyone hopes that one day they might write. So I'll set forth just two sets of reflections and comments, and I'll limit myself to speaking to each of them briefly, as I know we're short on time and scarce. and we're many on the panel, but I very much look forward to discussing all of this with you in the future. So my first set of reflections has to do with your argument for locating the onset of capitalism in this shift in early modern England from the sovereign monopoly over monetary creation to the sovereign ceding this power to the Bank of England and then to be powered by the pulse, or the pump as you call it, of private interests. And this also meant, of course, that significant dimensions such as public gains from seigniorage accrual written into the constitution of official legal tender would actually come to be collected by private investors in banking institutions, and then this is still being done today, of course, as Professor Coates was just talking about. And this undoubtedly marks a critical shift in the constitutional dimensions, one that erased its traces as money took off in both governmental discourse and in popular consciousness as the neutral veil, and then became retrospectively understood or read back or projected onto all of human history as merely being a medium that arose through spontaneous exchange and naturally occurring markets, through innate rational market behavior and quest to alleviate the inefficient and impractical burdens of a barter economy. And as you so brilliantly detail and critique this phenomenon, this narrative features in the dominant accounts of economics and the social sciences still today, and of critical theory alike. And what is more, this narrative prevails in works found across the political and ideological spectrum. So from Marx to Menger, as you concisely put it. And this broad-based narrative capture, I think, is testament to the dramatic force and staying power of this neutral veil epistemology of money, and by extension of human society and markets more broadly, within modern academic discourse, and then also within popular political consciousness. And indeed, this is a conception that has declined into common sense, more or less, with profound distributive and political effects. So I had a few questions that flowed from my reflections upon the central intervention of your book. And they're certainly in the spirit of just beckoning further commentary. They're not criticisms at all. So in the book, you so carefully, painstakingly carefully, it's quite incredible, excavate and analyze the histories and debates and imaginaries at the heart of this shift, the coming of capitalism, as you term it. And I would so love to hear you say a bit more about how you mark this particular moment, as opposed to other broader governmental and societal shifts, as the key moment in the turn to capitalism in early modern England. So some may read this shift as more a refraction of the broader twilight of so-called pre-modern, feudal, monarchical sovereign power, and in its decline vis-a-vis the ascendant bourgeoisie, and then amid the takeoff of many forms of, say, industry, new forms of labor markets, of property holding patterns, especially in forms of land tenure systems, and so forth. So here, the paternalistic pastoral modes of power and authority were fading, giving way to newer, or at least increasingly prevalent, arrangements. So this political and legal transformation within money's constitution happened within these broader historical contexts of a new form of public, even, a public of formerly free individuals, which you were mentioning in your introduction as well, who, for example, could sell their labor without having to apply for privileges to do so from kings, lords, and so forth. This shift in money creation also occurred at a particular time. If it had occurred a bit earlier, it effectively could have been read as a moment in which basically the nobility in England served as the public paying interest to private bankers for the new currency. But at this moment in England, with the gradual decline of feudalism, the emergence of so-called free labor, along with the emergence of forms of contract and property, there was a new form of public itself, a more general reconstitution of society and of a mass of free laboring or potentially free laboring, formally equal, non-status qualified individuals, among whom the cost was distributed. So here also, the notion of subjectivity itself was being redrawn or reconstituted, and there were ongoing shifts in what it meant to be, say, a willful, self-possessed individual subject, with all of the modernist legal, political, and social entailments of that. And of course, you're more than aware of this, and you just gave us beautiful remarks at the beginning about the historical reinvention of agency and refashioning amid this broader monetary shift. But I'm just trying to think of other dynamics people may use to account for this shift toward public borrowing for money creation and the decline of traditional sovereign power and so-called traditional forms of production in the face of reorganized labor and systemic crises in the absolutist so-called outgo that is not accumulation-based economy, as, say, North and Weingast have noted in their piece on the history of the times and the institutional economic architecture underwriting them. And then also the more generally the reconstitution of economy and society traced here. So in this setting, there was also a dramatic shift in notions of the body politic, right? So what particular subjects or citizens could reasonably claim and expect from a public sovereign authority and inscribe in a generally understood social contract. And so it might be easy to, retrospectively read back our notions of general will, social contract, and rights and entitlements and claims that can be made on a public authority in a certain way that might not have been immediately compelling or even intelligible or obvious to these citizens and subjects at the time. Okay, second set of reflections, and I will do this more briefly, has to do with your powerful denaturalization of money project, set within reference to other literatures that have attempted to address the same issue from various empirical and also theoretical vantage points. So I'm an anthropologist, and I have done some work mapping and critiquing the literatures on money in the fields of sociology and anthropology, predominantly under Chris's inspiration. And if pressed, I would say that probably all of those working in these fields would say that they too have been working to denaturalize money, to lay bare its various social, political, cultural, historically specific features across time and space. And within the past 2 or 3 decades, these projects have tended to fall, I would say, beneath the general theoretical canopies of performativity, critical knowledge production, and discourse analysis, whether in the more specifically relational or the network analytical or the microsociological or complexity theoretical veins. And so I would
Yeah, keep going.
Jargon fest over here. Jargon fest. Okay, I'm wrapping it up too, so just bear with me, indulge me. So I would read the contemporary literatures as bearing 3 dominant orientations. And then I will also argue that Chris makes a signal contribution to each. So first, the embedded approaches, which treat money as a dependent variable whose circulation and meaning is shaped by a pre-existing cultural context. 2, phylogenetic approaches, which treat money as a quasi-independent variable generative of its own particular cultural meanings and social relations, whether in professional networks or in whole societies. And then third, finally, state-centered approaches, which draw attention to the role of money and the role that it has played in creating sovereign space, as well as the ways in which the state has instated the value of money by first dictating a unit of account, and second, in requiring its collection in taxes, underwriting its present and future worth. And so while each of these approaches would claim a denaturalization project at their core, and while the third explicitly foregrounds the roles of sovereigns and states and constitutions of money, I would say that none, at least to my knowledge, has taken on your central problematic of tracing this central early modern political and ideological shift in the signal form of modern money creation through banking and multiple deposit creation. So I would love to hear you say just a bit more about this absent oversight in the contemporary denaturalization of money literatures. And as you compellingly argue, this modern form of money would come to be christened globally as the privileged and dominant form for state and also suprastate currencies, and now travels the world with the ideological cast of a universal transhistorical phenomenon. And I think the fact that you are the first to extensively trace this shift and to argue for its incredible performative and naturalizing power through such generative and original historical and theoretical work is very exciting, to say the least. And it's the reason that this book will be widely read across disciplines as a central and path-breaking contribution to our understanding of modern money and of the birth of the modern world more broadly. And I'll end there. I'm out of time, but thank you.
So I have a slightly different take on this. I want to begin, though, with a different kind of remark. So as I set out to read the book, I allocated more time to read it than it took. And the reason for that is that it's so well written. So just let me say, this is a book about an unbelievably technical topic. And over again, I would pick it up and say, now this is going to be 10 pages an hour. It's going to be...
And it is.
And it's just like a novel. It's like Gone Girl. I mean, just go right through it.
It's true.
It's quite surprising.
It's
It's
true.
quite surprising. And I'm really talking about a technical effect of good writing, which is actually it's easy to read, and therefore it's assimilable in a way that I didn't expect it to be. I would like to approach it in a quite different way, but consistently with what Chris didn't choose to emphasize its contribution to the historical literature on the periods and the topics that it covers in her remarks. She emphasized the denaturalization narrative. Obviously, because that's relevant, critical theorists are interested in denaturalization as a contribution to our understanding of our own politics. So I want to actually respond to that. What I found most interesting, I'm less myself drawn to the denaturalization argument of her book than I am to a second argument, which was alluded to by John, which is an argument about how the specific structure that emerged, the constitutional compromise, repeated over and over again, has distributive consequences. But no one's mentioned so far how that works. And so this is a reading of her book as for Krugman. So this book was designed to be put on Krugman's desk to make him feel empowered in his particular struggle in the arguments about policy in the financial crisis, past financial crisis, and future financial crises. So, just another sort of passing remark, Chris originally had a poster which had the commentators were John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith. So those were the commentators. And when I saw that, she showed me the poster and then asked me to be a commentator. I thought, wow, I mean, that is fantastic. Which one am I? This is cool. Reading the book, it is a brutal denunciation of these three figures. Locke is the actual villain of the whole book. The evil genius of the book is John Locke. Hume is an idiot who follows along the same lines, and Adam Smith is only very marginally superior. He has a tiny Keynesian element, which is just a tiny trace. So the book is a denunciation of the basic liberal way of understanding money. And its denunciation is not just critical in the denaturalization sense, it's critical in the very specific sense that it's about the distribution of power and welfare in society. It's about oppression and inequality. It's not just about denaturalization. Now, the reason why it's for Krugman is I'm just going to read a summary of the constitutional settlement, which is not the constitutional moments of the creation of the bank. Because the book's epilogue is the 18th century epilogue is the part that's addressed very directly to the present. So this is the constitutional settlement that emerges after the British return to convertibility, after the Napoleonic Wars, and the gold standard emerges. The settlement. In terms of monetary governance, the resolution defined the contractual expectations of those holding money as matters of right and located the claims of the domestic community as matters of policy. A right policy distinction embedded in the settlement. The right policy distinction corresponds today to the idea of a kind of division of authority between the Federal Reserve and Congress, in which what Congress is understood as doing is of a very different nature. It's just a fundamentally different nature. Second, the settlement rationalized the rescue of banks within the terms of the new system. Third, it appointed the banks as the agents that would make money for the larger society and appropriately reap the rewards for so doing. So the political thesis is denaturalization creates a structure within which then the idea of the stability of the monetary system, its consequences for the value of money and for creditors in her analytic, supersedes a way of thinking about the government's role in which the manipulation of the money supply by the government, understood as something the government is going to do, is appropriately adjusted to take effect of, for example, most basic, the deflationary effects of a stringent anti-deficit monetary policy. And that is to say, who suffers most? So today, it's the rhetoric of unemployment. It's the choice between inflation and unemployment, and the basic argument that inflation is all supreme consequence, and it doesn't matter how much unemployment is going to be generated by a policy that prevents inflation. So it's all right here laid out in the settlement that involves going back to a convertible currency in this very specific moment, which crashes the British economy and transforms it in fundamental ways, not at the level of the money system, which is now redone, but at a different level. Massive, unbelievable suffering in the countryside. All the Polanyi transformations that you may be familiar with that have to do with things like the Poor Law are driven, among other things, by a particular understanding of what distributive consequences can't be considered and what can be. What can be considered are distributive consequences for people who have been defined as right holders. What can't be considered is distributive consequences for people who would benefit by policies. So the right policy distinction privileges dramatically one sector of the population vis-a-vis other sectors of the population. So Krugman is obsessed with the question, what is the reason for the budget deficit obsessions of the American right? So a very basic question is, where does it come from? What is the idea of the punitive idea? So now I want to just add one bracket, another element. Her four things, leave out one, which should be the role of international markets. So a very important theme is that the gold standard involves allowing international markets, flows of capital, to determine the fates of economic policy in one country after another. And that's a fourth one that is absolutely characteristic of the crisis today. So the obsession with allowing the markets to determine what the government can do with respect to how much people are going to be screwed or driven into the ground by an emergent monetary policy is actually part and parcel of the whole thing. So he basically is driven quite often to try to interpret in psychological. These are bloody-minded people. They're also liars, and they're profiting from their evil political choices. A basic contribution of the book is to set up the structure, the identical structure that is now operating, the same right policy, the same idea of the centrality of banks. So to John, I would say, it's not really the argument in favor of it, in favor of allowing the system to operate in this way, that you can't tell distributive consequences in the short term, is, I'm sure, actually a good description of what the consequences would be of a modification of how you choose the president of the bank. But if the question is, could you devise a system in which it would not be plausible to do to the American public what the crisis has been allowed to do, the distributive consequences of the particular form combination of monetary and fiscal policy that emerges from the particular collaboration of Congress, the president, and Fed, those distributive consequences are obvious. And the basic idea is we ought to try to redesign the system so that wouldn't happen. Now, maybe we couldn't do it, and whatever would happen would be so unpredictable, so hard to consciously master the impacts as opposed to disposing them through the structure, that it's not worth it. Completely possible. Too unpredictable, not worth it. But the whole thesis of the anti-naturalization thing is not just that we need to recognize it's not natural. We need to recognize something else, which is we ought, in this case, to have an ethical imperative to transform it in the interests of the people who are being screwed by it. It's a reading.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for inviting me to be here. It's a real treat, and my thanks to Hal Jackson for introducing us. I've certainly benefited from our conversations and from reading the book, and I didn't agree entirely with everything that Duncan said, although with more than you might imagine. But you are completely right that it's a really easy read, and the only thing I'd add is that you come across some really great sentences, and that's also the mark of a good book. If I was 30 odd years a central banker, and most senior central bankers, and probably many junior ones, would regard themselves as inhabiting the world of ideas, of institutions, and the invisible hand. And this book is about all of those things, and it's been great for me kind of learning more about what I was doing for those 30 odd years and helping to make sense of it. It is, of course, a book about power, and it resonates today because it's about the constraints on power and how those constraints emerge and are thought of. Money under control of the sovereign, and as you say, a tradition largely established in England of sound money and so-called prudent fiscal policy. And the roots of this, and there are some real oddities in it, the roots of this, of course, is that money is cheaper to produce than its face value, whether it's coin or the notes that we carry around today. And one way of thinking about how monetary policy works today, which is relevant to where I'm going, is that what the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, the ECB, do is they create money by buying government bonds. And at a consolidated level, what that does is it changes the maturity structure of the state's debt. It shortens it, and what's more, the liabilities that are created, the monetary liabilities, do not bear interest, but society accepts them as the means of exchange, partly because of legal tender laws in exactly the way that you described, Chris. And so there is always something fiscal going on, and people within central banking absolutely perceive the monetary institutions as part of the broader fiscal state and are often surprised that commentators outside don't recognize that. And kind of more broadly, what this means, of course, is that monetary policy is always contingently a form of taxation, both in terms of the running yield it produces for the state and also, crucially, the power it gives the state, where the state is in charge of money, to impose taxation by inflating away debt or shaving away the silver and the gold on the coins. And you can think of that, whether it's debasing the coinage or inflating away, as tied up as with the potential abuse of this power, and how do you constrain that power? Because the odd thing here is that if the ability to create money can be used as a form of taxation, which it can, why on earth isn't that under the control of Congress and Parliament, rather than under the control of the executive branch or unelected people like me? Now, that bridges to something I want to say about Locke. But first of all, this is also about state building, and the medieval stuff is terrific because the peculiar thing about the country that I'm from is that it probably had in many respects the most developed state apparatus in the early medieval period, the Angevin kingdom. And a chunk I haven't read yet, to be honest, is what you say about the 14th century, when, of course, when the Black Death, that's something to look forward to, when the Black Death kind of undermined the structures of the state, and, as an aside, kind of undermined the first Renaissance that people don't really talk about in Europe. But whether Locke's the villain or not, I don't know. He is certainly the central figure, and I think for good reason. And something that I think is terrifically important about that, most economists and central bankers, to the extent that they are conscious of the history of what they do, will see Hume as being significantly more important than Locke. And I think that's nonsense. I think Locke is hugely more important, largely for the reasons that you say. And this was, of course, a moment of extraordinary constitution and state building in the United Kingdom. One of the differences between my country and the United States is that we had our Civil War before the constitution building, and you had yours afterwards, which is quite a puzzle if you're English. It was the moment where not only recently it's been topical, Scotland became formally part of the Union, but more importantly, the judicial independence was embedded, and the Bank of England was created. Now, you have made a good deal of the fact that the Bank of England was private, and of course it was. It was a deal between the merchant class backed by the Whig aristocracy and the Parliament and the Crown. But something that is tremendously important is that the Bank of England for many, many decades was subject to what in this country would be called sunset clauses. Its charters were time limited and repeatedly renegotiated in a power play between the kind of money interest, if you like, and the Crown and the Parliament. But before getting to my big point as I see it, let me just say that I don't think this is just about England. This is also about the Dutch Republic, in fact. Precisely because of my point about our Civil War was a serious point. This was a period in which many leading figures and many intellectuals were in exile, and they were largely in exile in the Netherlands. And Lisa Jardine has written very interestingly about this in Going Dutch. And whilst many people would say that the first central bank was the Riksbank in Sweden, the Netherlands can make a claim to the first kind of quasi-institutionalized monetary institution. And I think there's almost no doubt, sadly Lisa doesn't say very much about this, there's almost no doubt about the extent to which ideas traveled from the Netherlands to England during this period as part of a broader liberal constitutional settlement. And here's the important thing about Locke, because what Locke says is also about constraining the state, about constraining the ability of the monetary authority, whether executive branch or unelected people like me, to abuse their power. There is a great debate in England where the leading authorities on money all essentially want to debase the coinage. And Locke says, no, you mustn't do that. You need to decide kind of in an arbitrary way, is how it's often presented, by convention, how much these coins are worth. You decide that. And the way to think about this is a way of constraining the state in any of its manifestations, that it won't abuse the taxation power of money. And in that sense restores to the Parliament the power of taxation, because it will be the only body that can impose taxation rather than all those monetary people doing it. And to that extent, what's really interesting about that is that for me, chimes not only with Locke as liberal and liberal theorists, but also with kind of neo-republican theorists, people like Quentin Skinner and Philip Petit, who would think about the political order needing to manifest freedom as non-domination. This is about constraining the ability of the state to dominate its people by changing the value of money. Now, where I come to Duncan's point, and this is to say that I'm looking forward to the next volume, but you can't wait 10 years next time, it's got to be sooner, is the other part of the story is the gradual emergence of democracy. So you're absolutely right in what you say about the gold standard. But the gold standard operates during the 19th century in quite a violent way in the interests of the mercantilist class. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And it works by the price level is kind of held more or less constant, but unemployment and output swings around. And one of the great events in 20th century monetary practice is Montague Norman, the dominant governor of the Bank of England's desire to go back on the gold standard in the late 1920s, and he goes back on the wrong rate, and Churchill gets very fed up. And the crucial bit about this story that's never told is that this is in an environment of full franchise democracy. And so that at this point, the objectives of monetary policy shift away from providing a stable price level, and then the market can sort everything out, including mass unemployment at points in the 19th century. Two, we must use this power to stabilize the economy as best we can, so as to keep people in jobs, whilst at the same time not abusing the ability to tax. And that absolutely is the post-Bretton Woods, post-1970s story about monetary policy. And as I was reading everything you said about Locke and those debates, I thought, my God, this is exactly what's been going on as we have tried to design monetary constitutions over the past 35 years. One final point where I both agree with you and disagree with you. A number of points you say money isn't neutral. And I think that one needs to make a distinction between monetary institutions in the broadest sense of institution and money. I have absolutely no doubt that monetary institutions are not neutral in the sense that they help the economy work efficiently or not so efficiently. They may have distributive effects. And part of the Lockean revolution the revolution at the end of the 17th century is a change of monetary institutions that, for good or ill, did provide part of the basis, along with an independent judiciary, for what happened in England over the subsequent 100 years. And in that sense, monetary institutions aren't neutral. But within a set of monetary institutions, if you increase the amount of money by tenfold, the price level would increase by tenfold without anything happening. If when we walk out of this room, miraculously 2 extra zeros have been added to every dollar bill that we're carrying around, nothing would happen in the real economy. Almost absolutely nothing. And it's in that sense that economists are typically focusing when they say that monetary is neutral. I don't think they think that monetary institutions are neutral in the sense of not mattering. On the contrary. This is a book I shall go back to again and again for a variety of reasons. It dovetails incredibly well with what I'm trying to think about, and it's been a real treat to read it, and a real privilege to be here. Thank you.
I just want to embrace all of the comments with the exception of the last 3 sentences that Paul said. So I think it would be great if we had a debate in the law school curriculum about and I think we're beginning to have one, about the design, about reform right now in the Fed, right? That this should be a central part of the law school curriculum, not for economists, right? Not for finance alone. I think I wrote the book very much as a debate over distribution. Duncan's entirely right. And I think Paul's also entirely right that it's about separation of powers, among other things. This is a profound debate. And we should take Locke from social contract all the way to money in law schools. The only place I disagree, and I just have to put a footnote, is I actually did mean to write that money was not neutral, that I don't mean just that monetary institutions are not neutral. I think that's widely accepted, right? We understand that in the short term, the way monetary institutions act and the way they behave affects the price level. I was actually making a stronger claim, which is, to most briefly put this way, there's no way just to add 2 zeros to the money supply. Instead, the way money actually enters distribution and the way it comes out of circulation are all material matters that actually do affect the relative price level as that injection occurs. So there is a broader claim here, and I guess we have to leave it that Paul and I will discuss it, and the rest of you will have to, if you buy the book, you can see whether you think I carried the argument. Thank you.